It says we've been live for a while, so I think they've heard.
Yeah, that's lies.
And
It's not
we're
true.
live. No, that's the live on Zoom. This is the live on YouTube. It
Gotcha.
is Thursday, June 4th, 2020, 5:01 p.m. We're a minute late, for which I apologize. And I just want to say it is an unpleasantly hot day in Washington. I am sitting outside. I am dripping with sweat. And this is a vision of the future for the next few months. We have had a reprieve. We have had a stay of execution. But late spring in DC has arrived today, which is to say it is green, it is lush, the air is heavy with the oppressive heat and obnoxiousness of a town under occupation. People are on edge. And yet, here we are sitting in a garden with a blueberry mojito, smiling, because while we are not allowed to have fun anymore, we have David French, who is one of my very favorite people in the world to disagree with. Only increasingly, I find that David and I don't actually disagree very much, even though we disagree about everything. So, David, welcome to In Lieu of Fun.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
This is fun.
Yeah, and I have to say that late spring has arrived in Franklin, Tennessee as well. Getting close to that 90 degrees that we're going to be used to for a while now.
I know like
beautiful.
3 people in Tennessee, and I just imagine you all hang out with each other, although that's probably not true. Do you know Radley Belko? Do you hang out with him?
You know, I have never met him, although everybody knows Radley Balco, and we've never gotten together. I've reached out a couple of times. We've kind of missed each other, but
I'm
I'd
gonna
love
have
to get together.
Facilitate something. He was just on the show, and he and his wife are lovely. And so,
please do.
Great.
So, David, I want to start with your battle with Tom Cotton, because
do you know that guy eats a lot of birthday cake?
Because I just want to say, like, I have never seen anybody so trounced in a debate respond to it by doubling down with a New York Times op-ed.
Yeah.
Is that where that came from? Was it you, David?
So, David, am I getting the history of this wrong? As I understand this, the sequence of events are that Tom Cotton, who is a veteran and who knows military terminology reasonably well, he is a Harvard Law grad, as I recall, referred to giving no quarter to protesters. You pointed out that giving no quarter is a term of art, and it's a term of art for a war crime, that is, shooting people instead of taking prisoners. He responded that no, it wasn't, and he was standing by, saying that the police should give no quarter to. You guys had a bit of a back and forth in this, and then he doubled down today with an op-ed in the New York Times saying, "Send in the troops," which didn't specifically say give no quarter,
right?
But it did seem like he was following up. So, first of all, is my account of the history wrong? And secondly, what's up with Tom Cotton?
So what happened is he did an initial tweet where he basically said, you know, we need to do what we need to do to stop the rioting. And he'd like to see Antifa confront the 101st Airborne. Well, his use of the 101st Airborne was interesting because that's an active component. Active duty component. It's regular Army. It's not National Guard. And so people critiqued him for that. And so then he doubled down on it and he said that, yeah, we need to use 10th Mountain Division, 101st, 1st Cav, whatever, and give no quarter to insurrectionists, arsonists, rioters, and looters. Well, as you just said correctly, no quarter is a term of art in the military. Since 1863 in the Lieber Code signed by President Lincoln, it has been a war crime in the United States military to issue a no quarter order, which is essentially take no prisoners. You're going to kill everybody. This has been reaffirmed in international treaties. It's part of the international humanitarian law. It's Hague conventions. It's the most recent field manual on the law of land combat, law of land warfare, no quarter orders. So I pointed this out.
It's not a matter of opinion, right?
No. It's a very inflammatory thing to say. So he responds with the Webster's dictionary definition, basically saying what it really means, I didn't mean shoot prisoners. I meant no pity or no mercy. Okay. And then he begins to send out.
I love this from people who've gone to law school. Like other people I have a lot of like understanding for, but that's like.
It's going to law school talking to military people. I mean,
words have meanings.
He's speaking in a military context. If I go and say, we're going to give no quarter to those people at Just Security, no one would think I'm talking about shooting Ryan Goodman. They'd take it as friendly competition between legal blogs. But if you're talking about deploying troops, that's a different thing.
Well, and so then he begins to quote all these people who in other contexts, you know how military metaphors are all over the place in politics and sports. So, if you say Auburn's offensive line murdered Alabama, everybody knows you don't mean murdered Alabama, or if I'm going to give so-and-so no quarter in a political debate, they know that doesn't mean shoot prisoners. But if you're talking about, or don't take prisoners and shoot them instead, when you're talking about in the context of military operations, that is a word with a meaning, and a former infantry officer and Harvard Law graduate knows this. So he goes back and it's the classic sort of Mott and Bailey argument. I'm going to make the really bold, inflammatory statement, and then I'm going to retreat to Webster's. So we went back and forth on that basically for a bunch of Monday. And I think that's important context for the reaction to his op-ed. Because if he had just tweeted, for example, something along the lines of, what many people don't understand is military forces are often more disciplined and more restrained and better trained than police. And you will likely see fewer incidences that we've seen all over the place of active duty or National Guard military beating protesters. You won't see that. And we might actually turn the temperature down if we have a more restrained and more disciplined force. But instead, he gets very inflammatory. And that was the backdrop to the New York Times op-ed, which did not contain the no quarter language. It didn't contain all the bluster. But that was the backdrop to it.
So I raise this issue both because it's in the news right now, but also because it reflects a drift of smart people into inanity. Tom Cotton is not an idiot. He is a learned fellow both in the law and in matters military. He served, I think, I don't know in what capacity, but he was and here he is, pardon me, talking nonsense out of his ass, even when called on by somebody. And for those of you who don't know, David is a former JAG, and you were, and also a lawyer and a legal writer. And this is not a matter of opinion. And so this fits into a pattern that you have spent a lot of time reflecting on. I'm interested in it seems to me a part of a pattern of the sort of active embrace of kind of know-nothingism and ignorance. Am I reading too much into it?
Well, I think so, and Tom Cotton did a very good thing today, in my view. He went on the Senate floor and he asked for that America take in more refugees from violence in Hong Kong.
Good.
which I support. He served
Yep,
honorably.
me too.
He served honorably in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was an infantry platoon leader, I believe. I think what happened is Cotton, like many other senators, occasionally tries on MAGA clothes, and they don't fit well. And so you'll have a situation where Tom Cotton, who's a cerebral guy, who's, agree with him or disagree with him, is a very thoughtful, he approaches foreign policy and military policy thoughtfully. Every now and then, some of these guys put on the MAGA clothes. And that was kind of a MAGA type tweet. It was very blustery. It was very threatening. It was over the top. It was irresponsible. That's part of the sickness that is infecting the GOP right now. I mean, this is something that you'll see from Ted Cruz when he's talking about social media. And Kate knows this. Well, Senator Cruz will just say stuff that is completely wrong about the law. And he's, again, Harvard law grad, who is prided himself on being a constitutional conservative, has argued before the Supreme Court of the United States, and then he'll just tweet stuff that's flat out wrong, that is right in line with MAGA world. And that's what I call like putting on the MAGA shirt, or the cap, more likely.
Yeah, so all of this leads somebody like you into a very complicated space, because unlike a lot of the never Trump conservatives, you have a high wall that keeps you from ever being, becoming sort of more of a Democrat.
Right.
You're a conservative Christian. There are certain pre-political commitments that are that are unbridgeable for you with a lot of the political progressive world. So, and yet you're political. You're not, you're a legal analyst and a political observer, but you're not going to become a sort of quietist, Amish type. So what happens to the people like you?
Well, that's a really good question. I honestly don't have any idea. I think I'm kind of in a really uncomfortable space in a lot of ways. Some of my friends in sort of the never Trump right, who you would not call social conservatives, who have, what's the classic three legs of the Reagan Republican stool was, pro-life, smaller government, and muscular American foreign policy. And so there were people who would be in that tent because they belong to two of those three, they agree with two of those three legs, or maybe they agree with one of those legs very strongly. And so the people who are not social conservatives, for example, I think, and because of the populism of Trump had triggered in many ways a reaction on the Democratic side of the aisle, that in many ways you began to see Democrats expressing belief in muscular American alliances more strongly, not that they didn't before, but more strongly, more welcomed and open to free trade. And you begin to see, some Democrat moves that in response to Trump's sort of populist nationalism, that a lot of folks who are not in part of the social conservative wing of the GOP could find more of a home. But at the same time, the Democratic Party is moving more to the left on social issues. So somebody like me is not, I think the last pro-life member of the Democratic Party was defeated in the House anyway, was defeated in 2018. So somebody like me is just maybe not all that welcome in the Democratic Party. But at the same time, I just absolutely cannot get on board with Trumpism. I cannot get on board with nationalist populism. I cannot get on board with the illiberal right in any way, shape, or form. And so, yeah, there's a reason why my colleague at the Dispatch, Jonah Goldberg, called his podcast The Remnant. And I'm still mad at him for taking that name. We kind of feel like a remnant of a conservative movement that for right now is fading away, and it remains to be seen whether it will ever come back.
I want to follow up on this because I really was going to, this perfect segue, because I was going to bring up the idea of like the big tent idea is something that like Democrats have always referred to them as, if all of these factions. I wrote my honors history thesis from college on Phyllis Schlafly and basically the entire battle over the Equal Rights Amendment, which I saw as being undone more or less by like a very amorphous and kind of what is the word? Kind of just there was a diaspora of like people all over and all different types of things on the left that couldn't organize the way that Schlafly did in order to kill the ERA.
Right.
But like, I actually think that what Trump has shown us is that there are just as much there. And you hear tribalism as this thing that everyone's talking about now. It's all tribalism. But yes, of course, it's been norms and tribalism all the way down for a long, long time. And I'm very interested, like, what your thoughts are on the idea that maybe Trump has just shown us that there are just as many disparate kind of camps under the big tent of the Republican Party as there were, and that all of these little moves by like Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, Hawley, whoever, are like attempts to kind of test what those boundaries are. It almost feels like people trying to go and grab somebody's crown or like seize a little more land and see if they get like pushed back. I don't know. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I would describe it like this. And I'll crib from my colleague, Jonah Goldberg, who said this very well. 5 years ago, if you had asked me, is the right more ideological or is it more coalitional? I would have said ideological. That there was...
How do you define that, just really quickly?
Yeah, I would say, going back to the three legs of the stool, limited government, pro-life, muscular foreign policy, that was, when people use the term rhino, Republican in name only, what they were meaning was, you're deviating in some way from this consensus point of view, smaller government, pro-religious liberty, pro-life, et cetera. And so there was a sense, this is what the conservative movement is. Now there's different factions of it in the sense of what emphasis did they place on each part of it. But then what 2015, 2016 and the rise of Trump revealed is maybe it's not all that ideological. That what you have are various coalitions. You have the religious conservatives who are narrowly focused on these issues. You have immigration hawks narrowly focused on these issues. You have, and you can just go around to the various coalitions.
And some of the highest people, I think, in the right, Bill Kristol, like some of it's just like, I just name one, just like completely abandons Trump and like this entire.
Yeah. And so what ends up happening is you have these different coalitions that are united by what? One thing, anti-left, by being anti-left. So the sense is, well, we can fight like cats and dogs amongst each other, but once the thing is settled and you have Trump as a standard bearer, whoever, then we turn and we're united against the left. And so it's a coalition, it's coalitional on sort of what ideological strain triumphs in any given moment, or the ideology is less important than taking care of all the coalitions, but the real thing is anti-left. And you see this, and the stand-in for the left typically is the media, the media. And so that's why every story about Trump if you follow right-wing media well or closely, eventually becomes a media story. It's always a media story. Everything's always a media story because that's the last thing that sort of unites all the coalitions.
That's a beautiful.
Okay, but hang on a second. I want to push back on that.
All right.
Because in order to have anti-left be the actual organizing coalitional principle, you have to have a definition of the left. And surely the avatar of the left is not CNN. Right? Because no leftist identifies with CNN. And so I largely agree with what you've just described, But I think it does run into this point, which is, what is the lodestar that they're defining on the left? Is it whatever Nancy Pelosi happens to be saying and representing? I don't think she's that much of an ideological lodestar. Is it, Trump borrowed so much from the rhetoric of the Democratic Party, whether it was on Iraq and WMD, or, sort of triangulating things like taxes during the campaign, or free trade, right? So he was not a pure ideologue by any means. And so my question is, what's the defining leftism against which they are all organized?
That's a great question. So complicated answer. So let me make it too simplistic.
Also, I don't want to say, David, we understand you don't speak for all conservatives, or everyone on the right, so to speak, right? I mean, but yes, this is.
Well, David really doesn't speak for the Trumpists.
Well, I'm putting on like my analyst hat as somebody who lives, I live in the heart of MAGA country. I mean, so, you know how for many years there was the Iranian regime would talk about the great Satan and the little Satan. So the great Satan was the United States and the little Satan was Israel. The sort of Trump right has the great Satan, the media, and variable little Satans, depending on the news cycle. So the great Satan, and it's not CNN, I mean, because it's just whatever manifestation of the either the mainstream media, the left media, or the never Trump media is most annoying on the given day. And so, to give you a great example of how this dynamic works, on Monday, you had the Battle of Lafayette Park, where it's not really a battle. It was more like the brutality of Lafayette Park, where federal law enforcement and some military police violently attacked peaceful protesters to clear the way for a photo op. So how do you defend Trump there? Well, remember, you're mobilizing against the media, and what the defense of Trump wasn't so much a defense of Trump. It was an attack on the media for reporting that tear gas was used when it appears that it was likely a riot control agent called pepper balls or pepper spray that was used, as opposed to CS gas. So therefore, the story then becomes fake news media slanders Trump administration by claiming tear gas was used when it was just pepper balls. Now, never mind that tear gas is an imprecise umbrella term used to describe all sort of riot control irritants. Those are details. So the media is like the great Satan. The little Satan can be variable. It can be campus social justice warriors in one news cycle. It can be AOC and the Squad in another news cycle. It can be Pelosi in another news cycle. It can be Sleepy Joe in another news cycle. But the unifying entity is the media. And I'll just tell you this, if I ever write in defense of the media, because I've kind of been on this little one-man crusade to get people to stop saying the media.
Right. There is no the media.
There are reporters and outlets. And if you have a problem with what a reporter says or an outlet says, say it. Don't ascribe like one Washington Post story to the media. But anyway.
The media includes everything from MSNBC to the Dispatch, to the Dispatch, to the Playboy channel, if that still exists. Right, that's the media.
But
Netflix.
Right. Well, in some ways, and so I've written in defense, not basically saying, look, let's stop using the media. Number two, all of these critics of the media, a lot of you guys don't even have any idea how hard this job is to try to figure out what happened in any given moment in the middle of the sort of the fog of war, like from people who are willing to lie to you and don't want you to know the truth. That's really, really hard. And I talk about this, and even amongst Trump skeptical conservatives, that sort of feeling of opposition to the media is so strong that I will get strong pushback for making that point, even from people who are sort of otherwise aligned with me on my attitude about the Trump administration. So that's how by September, October, the great Satan might be Joe Biden. But on a day-to-day and day-out basis, the great Satan is the media, and the little Satan depends on the news cycle.
So we live in a two-party system about which you're sophisticated, and there was once talk of you as a third-party presidential candidate. That didn't last all that long.
No.
I didn't know that. Really?
In 2016.
You gonna run for president, David?
That's a long story, Kate, but
Bill Kristol tried to recruit David to run for president and eventually settled on Evan McMullen, right?
Mm-hmm. That's the Reader's Digest version. Yes.
But at the end of the day, we have two broad political coalitions. And for the next few years anyway, one of those broad political coalitions is Trumpist, and the other ranges from, I would say, the center and gently left of center, but importantly, left of center on cultural issues to hard left. That's the alignment right now. So I don't want to ask you who you vote for, because that's not I don't ask questions like that. But how do you deal with the political alienation associated with that being the fundamental choice in life?
Well, I don't view myself primarily as a member of a political tribe. That's not the center of my identity. And one thing I speak to, I often speak to Christian college students, and back when we had things called speaking engagements, do you remember those
right.
things?
Yes, before we did them like this.
I used to travel 3 times a week, and now I'm like, I literally used to just have like a routine in which I would pick up my favorite things at like the JetBlue terminal, like at the Muji store. I had like routines that were based in freaking airports.
I know, me too. But I would tell these students, and I would say, look, if your religion is, if your faith is number one in your life, you cannot have a partisan mind. Okay, now what I meant by that is not that you can't join a political party, not that you can't vote for a political party. You should be involved. You should be informed. You should be involved. You should vote. But the core of your mind, the core of your identity should not be partisan. Because if the core of your identity is partisan, then you're putting something above your faith. And so what do you ultimately ground yourself in? And so for me, when the party that I'd belonged to my entire adult life began to espouse values and to champion a person values that I thought were repugnant, and a person that I thought was of very extraordinarily low character, that place in that political party was not the most important aspect of my identity, not even close. And so, it was, in a sense, easy to make, in one sense, it was easy to make that call to break with the GOP and Trump. In another sense, it had very difficult ramifications with personal relationships and all of the horror that occurs online and elsewhere. And so that part was difficult, but the decision itself, the consequences were difficult, but the decision itself was easy because it's a matter of priorities.
I think that is, oh, sorry, Ben, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
I would love to drill down on this for 1 second. So I was making fun of, someone said, it's just 26 words, people, speaking about section 230, and I quoted Leviticus, and the quote, basically the sum of which is the golden rule, but I like the Leviticus kind of like formation of it better than Matthew, and like that this is kind of this thing that which I have always wondered about, and like your consistency is really, I think, and I'm not just saying this, like it's incredibly admirable, but like many people are not that consistent and do bend to like the pressures of like whatever it is that's going on around them. And I've always wondered this, and so I don't know what to make, for instance, as a person who I was very pro-immigration before this was like a thing. Like I was like, borders seem abhorrent and people are like, you're a crazy anarchist. I'm like, no, have you ever just like thought about the idea of borders and like the accident of birth? Like why we can keep people out of like one type of country and like bring other people in. This is bizarro. And like, it was always amazing to me that like there was simultaneously on the left, and like, and I also ascribe by this. I try to do this in my daily life as an economic matter, is to buy local and to do whatever. And I feel like no one is having the hard conversation of like, if you buy local, you don't buy from families in China who might need money more than the people that you're buying locally from. Or like the fact that if you decide that you're anti-immigration, it means that people can't come and live in the land that you think is so wonderful, but you think it's wonderful. And like, you want to be here. And so like, there's just like a lot of ideological inconsistencies in these things, like that have never made sense to me. And they're true, as much true on the left as they are on the right, I guess, is like what the last couple of years has shown me.
Well, you know, one of the things, so I think there's a couple of things about your point. One is, what are your values? Which a lot of people don't really know what their values are until they're tested, to be honest. So C.S. Lewis once said that courage is the form of every virtue at its testing point. So you don't know if you're truthful unless it costs you something to be truthful. You don't know if you're faithful unless there is a temptation to infidelity. You know, whatever you want to name it. You don't know who you are until it's truly tested. So that's sort of the values. Do you value telling the truth? Then what do you do with the values? Often gets super complicated. But I like to try to drill down to the basic values. And if we can agree on the basic values, we can move forward with a sense of fellowship and goodwill. What really distressed me about the rise of Trump is I began to see that there were people who are no longer agreeing on certain very basic values. So for example, the value of telling the truth, or do we shun cruelty in favor of kindness? I mean, like, these are super basic personal values that you know, if you had gone back in a time machine to 2015 and you could look at some of Trump's most prominent defenders right now, and if I told them their 2015 selves, you will defend this and this and this and this, they would be angry. They would have said,
"You're lying." Right.
They would be angry. You don't know me. But what ended up happening is there wasn't actually consensus on a lot of these core values. And so we didn't even get to the complexity of what do you do once you share these values in a really difficult and complicated world where we don't have all the information we need, and et cetera, et cetera.
So I want to ask you about shared values, because I think that actually goes to a very deep component of the problem, which is we used to believe all kinds of different things and have an awareness at some level that we didn't share certain values, right? I am a Yiddish speaking immigrant in New York who has never been west of the Hudson River. And you are a farmer whose family has been here for 200 years, and you've homesteaded the same plot in rural Ohio since the late 1700s, right? And we're really aware that we don't occupy the same worlds as one another, but there are some certain set of tectonic values that we do share in common, and we may not even know to articulate them, but we do share them in common, and we understand that about one another. And so we agree to live in a values mosaic because one of the values that we actually share is the value of the values mosaic. It seems to me that one of the things that has changed in the last few years is that we no longer value the values mosaic, and we are going to war with one another over the different things that we happen to believe, whereas we used to actually be okay with the fact that we believe different things. And in Franklin, Tennessee, people are, there's a different set of community values than there are in Northwest Washington. And, when you come to Northwest Washington, we're in my town. And when I come to Franklin, Tennessee, I'm in your town.
Right.
And my question is, how do you put back together the sense that diversity, and here I mean diversity not in the sense of ethnic diversity or racial diversity, but just values diversity, that kind of diversity is fine?
Yeah. So I'm going to quote George Washington, the Bible, and the musical Hamilton.
Hell yes. Good. Hell yes.
So George Washington, almost 50 times in his correspondence, including his legendary letter to the synagogue in Rhode Island, quoted this verse from Micah. And I don't have it right in front of me, so I'm going to paraphrase it. That every man shall live under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And what that does is it speaks to, this is a land that where you, whether you're, a Jewish immigrant to this brand new nation in, 1790, whatever, or you're, wherever you are, however you've gotten here, whatever community you belong to, whatever your race or ethnicity, you can find a home here. You can find a place here. So that seems to me to be along the lines of, we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights is part of this sort of one of the core promises of America. It's one of the reasons why the racial injustice that we've seen and the violence against African Americans that, from the Ahmaud Arbery killing to George Floyd, that's a violation of that promise, right? That, that you will have your own place here and no one shall make you afraid. And it's particularly grievous when it comes from the instruments of the state. So to me, that's a fundamental overarching value that we need to rediscover. And then how do you do it? I mean, that's where it gets super, super complicated. But here's one of my more basic tenets is that, well, the sort of the operative version, sort of the legal version of how you make that social compact a reality is the Bill of Rights. That's sort of if the preamble to if the opening words of the Declaration of Independence are like this sort of the promise, the Bill of Rights is like the promise operationalized. And there's sort of this underlying principle here that said that we should have that say, I will defend your rights as zealously as I defend my rights, because they're the same thing. In defending your rights, I defend my rights. In you defending my rights, you defend your rights. And I feel like that very basic social compact, rediscovering that is is necessary for any form of national reconciliation at all, because we're not going to have the same faith. We're not going to have the same ideology because of the incredible diversity of this place, just geographically and economically and in all kinds of ways. We're not even going to grow up with sort of the same outlook on life or the same culture. It's just getting more diverse and more different. But how can we forge some unity out of that diversity? Go back to that basic social compact. And, that's my modest proposal.
I could not agree with that more. I think the idea that the active defense of another's rights because they are one's own rights is a foundational merging of self-interest and empathy in a fashion that is very critical to understanding our place in a society. And I think it's just a really important idea that we seem to be losing touch with.
Yes.
It comes from Locke's letter on tolerance, I think, originally.
It comes from like mere Christianity, to quote C.S. Lewis again. It comes from, I just think it's all over. I mean, it's like literally in Harry Potter. Like, I mean, you can find this thing everywhere, but why are we not taking this up as like a political mantle? it goes to Elizabeth's question. We have a question from the audience. Elizabeth Dorico, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Go ahead and unmute yourself. You had a great question.
Well, we seem to be
Sorry
there she
about
goes.
that. I've
There
been
we go.
Zooming all day and keeping myself on mute. Yeah, my question, I work in the legal space, and there's been a lot of conversation about the rule of law and inculcating civic virtue and a shared civic understanding of the role of the legal system and how the legal system operates, and that we've lost that context of civic virtue and civic engagement in that sphere, our responsibility to be a juror, those kinds of things. What is your prescription for ways in which institutionally we can get that back so that we understand where those shared values are? I think my observation is, we always talk in the extremes, and most of us are in the muddled middle on a lot of things. And we haven't created a lot of space for dialogue in that place. And it just seems to be going into your corners.
Man, that's a great question. So
we have smart listeners here. It's like insane. Actually.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I have kind of two principles. One, I think that enmity is the enemy of liberty, because you're very much, human beings are just unlikely, just the way we are, imperfect as we are, we're unlikely to want to defend the liberty and the fundamental rights of people we despise. It's hard to get us to do that. We're not built like that. So enmity is the enemy of liberty. So then however I can use whatever public voice I have, I try to be the enemy of enmity. And one of the things that you said that was so true was how we seem to move into our corners very, very quickly. And I think the way that happens is there is actually a process that you see all the time online that facilitates that. Because honestly, if you're going to read through Twitter, if you're going to read through Facebook, what is the voice that comes through? Is it the voice of sort of the muddled, I'm trying to figure out what's happening, good faith, middle, left and right? Or is it to quote the Yeats poem, the best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity? Are you getting the passionate intensity of often some of the worst voices? And one of the things that I try to do is I try to elevate the best voices on the other side, the people who I think articulate even positions opposing to me the best, who are some of the best people I know from the other side. I try to elevate them. And then the other thing that I try to do is I try to really avoid this phenomenon called nut picking. I didn't originate the term. I believe it's Kevin Drum.
It's a great term.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And once you know this term, you'll see it all over social media. And what nut picking is when you find the worst voice on the other side or the craziest voice on the other side or whatever, and you elevate them as sort of emblematic of the whole and say, see, that's what they're really like. And you see this all the time on Twitter. Like when Barbara Bush died, there was outpouring from across the spectrum of sympathy for her, left, right, center. But there was like one professor who had a blue check out in California who said some really crass things about Barbara Bush. She immediately became, in the right side of the internet, the most famous professor in America. Because see, that's what they think. Not this one person, they. And it's one reason why surveys show that some of the people who are most engaged in politics, who consume the most political media, are the most wrong about the political views of their opponents. They tend to believe that their opponents are substantially more extreme than they really are.
That's so interesting. Can I ask you a question about, so, when Yeats wrote The Second Coming, the line, the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passion and intensity, I think that was written in the early 20s, and I think, though I'm not sure I've ever looked up the history of this, that the line "the worst are full of intensity" was a reference to Lenin, or at least to the Bolsheviks more generally, and the sort of sense of the decency of the old order, or any order, collapsing in that period. When I hear "the worst are full of passion and intensity" these days, I confess that my mind immediately goes to Sean Davis and Mike Hemingway, and the crowd around the Federalists. And I'm concerned, in light of your comment just now, that that's a subconscious nut picking. And my question is, how do you know when you're nut picking and when somebody actually is representative of something?
That's a really good question. I mean, I struggle with that myself, because I have to decide, as somebody who's writing in response to ideas, when is an idea?
Which ideas? Yeah.
Which ideas? When is an idea important enough to address? And so I sort of have some shorthand rules, like how big a following does this person have? I mean, one of the absolute indicia of nut picking is when you take somebody who's relatively not well known, and you perversely make them well known through your elevation of their toxic speech.
Yeah, you amplify their speech.
You amplify it, exactly. So am I amplifying their speech, or do they have such a platform that even though it's thoughtless or toxic, it has to be responded to because they have such a large platform? And you'll see on the right side of the internet, which I'm more familiar with than the left side, there are a number of people who have followings in the millions who are extraordinarily toxic, just extraordinarily toxic. I mean, to take a recent example is this Michelle Malkin, who has moved entirely into defending
this college classmate.
Is that right? Defending these people.
Oberlin College class of 1991. She and I were in a class together with her husband, C. Malkin.
That's amazing. What a small world.
She was Mickey Maglalang then.
Wow. Well, so she's been supporting these people. They call themselves the America Firsters or Groypers, and defending a guy named Nick Fuentes, who has a much smaller voice than hers, but has engaged in Holocaust denial. Just really has gone, into just alt-rightism. But she has maybe more than 2 million followers. You have to respond to that. It's worth responding to that. And so I look at it as a combination.
I have a similar issue with Dan Bongino.
Right, he's a guy with a big following.
And I say this hesitantly because I don't think he's in my weight class intellectually. But he's got millions of followers. And so when he tweets at me, I feel a certain obligation to, not let him simply engage his followers on the basis of false, sometimes very crazy information.
Well, that's a whole other thing. When do you respond to somebody who's tweeting at you? I mean, can
I just throw up that this is very Streisand effect? Like, it's not like we haven't been here before. Like,
totally.
this is not in the scale that like David's talking about, but like Streisand effect is the idea that like Barbara Streisand famously sued for defamation, someone that would like their defamation in which they had like alleged against her would never have even made the papers. No one gave a shit. Mm-hmm. And like, she just like fuel to the fire type of thing. And so that became the Streisand effect, was like, if you decide to litigate like a defamation claim, kind of counterintuitively, you in fact inflame the entire controversy and bring light to the idea that you were like, of whatever harm that you were, what communications tort you undone. Right. So like, I just want to say that this is like not totally new. What we're seeing is now that like, instead of choosing whether or not we decide to sue someone, it's like whether we decide to retweet them or talk to them or acknowledge their presence, which is like a much more like, I would say restrictive version of self-censoring.
And it's moment to moment.
Really interesting point.
Yeah, it really is. And so the other thing is sometimes people will bait you. They're trying to bait you into a confrontation. And I have to say, like, I don't get involved in Twitter fights that much. I tweet, but I don't get involved in Twitter fights that much, often because I find that what's happening is people are baiting me. So some of the names that you've mentioned today bait me.
I tried to bait you in 2018.
Oh, did you really? Did I take it up?
You published an op-ed in the New York Times about Alex Jones and the takedown. And I was like, what is this fresh hell? But no, I've always respected your writing and everything you've done. And so like, I was just like, I felt like that New York Times op-ed didn't hit the mark of what I thought was going on. And I actually kind of wanted to bring it up when we were like bantering or just like talking offline.
Oh, sure.
To see if you changed your mind about that. Cause you don't seem to be the same person that wrote that op-ed.
Well, so, one of the things that's unfortunate about an op-ed, especially one in the Times, is you don't have all the room to develop your argument. And so my argument has always been that these platforms should be able to and are entitled to create a particular kind of culture that says, this is a family-friendly space, or this is a less family-friendly space, or you name it. But I felt like when you have somebody who is engaged in conduct that I think would be, and for Alex Jones was, I believe, unlawful, and I think ultimately found to be unlawful, defamation of these Sandy Hook parents, you don't have to dive into, is this hate speech? Is this not hate speech? And there are ways that we can use free speech principles that have been, and doctrines that have been developed within free speech context, First Amendment context, like harassment, like intentional infliction of emotional distress, like defamation, that give people sort of a firmer footing to know what's prohibited and what's not. And so I thought that would be a better way. And I think that was actually the title of the op-ed.
It is. But that was actually, like, I was very interested in that because I wrote a whole story. Wrote a whole law review article about how they judge, about how platforms like Facebook and everything judge defamation, public figures and newsworthiness. I think that like, you're exactly right. 1,000 words is really just truly not enough to bring out all the intricacies. And I actually think that we're totally, which is like why I was so a little bit surprised when we were talking with Jeff Rosen the other day, because I was like, oh, we agree about everything. Everything David is saying, I like completely agree with. And I was like, glad I came into this conversation with open priors of like being able to change what I thought. But yeah, I think that maybe we should like write another op-ed for the Times. Yeah. That would be fun.
I'd enjoy that. Absolutely.
Chris Taylor, the floor is yours.
David, thank you. In this world of COVID, it's very difficult to be sitting under our vines and fig trees without feeling afraid.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. The issue to me is, one, being older, but seeing that the silence of the GOP and silence of a lot of my friends are their core values changing to be more toxic, or are they actually attracted to Trump ideology? Why are they staying silent?
Well, one thing that we just have to mention here is the role of fear. So fear drove a lot of in particular evangelical support of Trump in 2016. A lot of it was this sort of Flight 93ism, like America will be over kind of fear. But then there's another kind of fear that applies in the age of Trump, and that is fear of personally directed cruelty. Adam Serwer in The Atlantic wrote an essay years ago, early on in the Trump era, that I think just the title of it alone hits the mark. The cruelty is the point. And there is an enormous wave of cruelty that is directed at dissenters in the GOP, just enormous. And human beings are human beings. And we're kind of pain avoidance creatures. and one of the things that I think that people who are sort of outside the GOP or have not had a public voice in conservative circles don't fully appreciate is the extent to which there's a real effort to just inflict pain on people who deviate. And the pain can take many forms. It can take online harassment. It can be real world harassment. It can be efforts to destroy your career. It can be efforts to shame you up one side and down the other. It can be the primary challenge, et cetera, et cetera. So, some of it is normal, tough politics, like a primary challenge. Some of it is just overtly much worse than that. And so one of the things that you'll see is that there are people who have feelings about Donald Trump that they will not voice publicly as a pain avoidance strategy. It's a fact. It just, we can talk about whether or not that's lame or cowardly or whatever, but it just is. And that's been actually one of the most effective means, in my view, of party discipline. And it filters down into normal social media, like with normal folks, high school classmates of mine who I've never seen them react the way I've seen them react in defense of Donald Trump, or college classmates of mine who I've known them for 30 plus years and will react with fury and vengeance and ad hominem and personal attacks. And I think that is a factor in the silence, is normal people don't want to endure that.
I think that's right. And look, I mean, your experience is an example of that. I mean, not everybody has the fortitude to go through what you have been through, and we haven't really talked about that. But you wrote a lengthy piece about it, and for those who want to know what the cost is of being the kind of voice that you have been, I commend that piece.
It's an incredible piece. This is the one in the Atlantic.
Yeah, well, there was a second one in the Atlantic. There was a one I wrote in National Review. The original
one was in National Review.
In 2016, and then I revisited the whole issue again in the Atlantic.
Andrew McMahon, you have a comment and a question.
Yeah, I think that the comment is what I'd really like to hear about. I'll ask you the question too. So that I read a piece by your wife about you and David Lee Roth. So if you talk to us a little bit about that, that is one of my all-time favorites. But the question, I'll try to keep it brief. So it's my understanding that there's an old evangelical tradition that it's too risky to get involved in politics. Politics is worldly. It's going to corrupt us. And I am always having the thought that hasn't the Trump effect on some in the evangelical community, I mean, not to be too dramatic about it, but it seems like it's vindicated that tradition a bit because the negative effect is extreme.
Yeah. So first on your comment, for those who don't know this story, my wife wrote about it. It's really crazy. We got married. I'll tell you the Reader's Digest version of it. We got married. We didn't know each other very well. We were married for 6 weeks. I mean, we dated for 6 weeks, got engaged, were engaged for 3 months, and got married and moved to New York, where I started to work at a big firm, not super big, but.
When was this?
This is 1996. Okay. And moved to New York, and I start working for a firm, and I'm gone. I mean, Kate, you know how this goes, the big firm hours.
I mean, I do know, but I successfully avoided it.
You are a wise woman. So I was working these brutal hours, and unbeknownst to me, people were calling our apartment asking for David. Lots of women were calling the apartment asking for David. And so my wife.
I've heard this story. Oh my God, I forgot this story. Holy cow. So
my
good.
wife,
okay, sorry.
My wife, who truth be told, barely knows me, is like, and people had warned us not to get married because we barely knew each other, It's like, what are you talking about? You know, David, can I speak to David? He's not here. Can I take a message? No, you know, click. And then this is happening. I don't really know about it because it's like right early on when I'm working. And then she has no idea what's going on. And then a man calls and asks for David. And she says, well, he's at work. And he says, well, what do you mean he's at work? I'm supposed to know when he's working. What are you talking about? And he says, who is this? And she says, it's his wife. What? His wife? And it turns out that the person on the other phone was David Lee Roth's agent. And we had, when we moved into the apartment, David Lee Roth's old phone number from Van Halen. And so we were getting calls from girls he'd met, from agents, from club owners like in Manhattan asking us to events. Like literally for about the first 2 to 3 months of our marriage, we were getting piles of David Lee Roth's calls. And it got so bad at one point, and Nancy I don't think she put this in the Washington Post story. I actually kind of broke up with a girl for him because she calls late at night.
No, she does put this. There's somewhere in this story because
Somewhere
I
in
do
there.
remember this.
Yes. So she calls late at night and she's like, it's David there. And I said, you're looking for David Lee Roth. This is not David Lee Roth. This is not his phone number. I think he changed numbers recently. Oh, well, this is the number he just gave me. I'm sorry. Do other girls call here? And I said, I'm sorry, but yes, you know, oh, and we spent some time on the phone with like me consoling her. I mean, it was the craziest thing. And it's a story we used to tell.
You're a good Christian, David.
It's a story we used to tell over and over and over and over again. And then for years didn't tell it because it was like old news. And then Nancy said, you know what? I think this is a funny story that nobody's heard. And so she wrote about it in the Washington Post and it just went viral. So that's the David Lee Roth story.
It's a wonderful story. I've just shared it with the Zoom audience. I will do the same with the YouTube audience. Before we close though, please give us your thoughts on Andrew's question, which I think is a good one on which to end.
Okay, remind me what the question was.
What was the question?
Whether the way the evangelical movement has been altered by by its embrace of politics justifies its traditional quietism.
Yeah, the quietism of evangelicalism was certainly not universal. I mean, there were the tradition I came out of, which was the a cappella churches of Christ in the South, was very.
Yeah, where did you grow up, David?
I was born in Opelika, Alabama, just outside of Auburn, and grew up in a little town called Georgetown, Kentucky. And so the tradition I came out of was very disengaged. It has now changed completely. And I think that there is something that the evangelical church can learn from that quietism, which is, and I don't agree that you should completely disengage, but not believing that the fate of the church rests on the fate of political battles. You know, the folks who are involved in churches that were who were more disengaged, they weren't looking at Washington as determining whether their church was going to flourish or thrive. They weren't. That was barely relevant, if relevant at all, in their idea about whether or not the church was going to thrive. And so I think the appeal of politics, the temptation of politics for evangelicals has become giving yourself over to the partisan mind, where I'm on this team, I am with this team, and look, if I have to stomach a Donald Trump to stay on the team, I'm going to do it.
I will say this, and I think that like everything that you said is completely correct, but I weirdly grew up with a lot of very religious people, both Roman Catholics, born again Christians, Mormons, and I was oddly entrenched in the Baha'i community. That's a long story.
Oh, wow. That is quite the story.
Yeah. But basically like I was very theological when I was in high school in particular, and like in my younger 20s. And I just think that there is something to be said for living with people who live with religion and watching them kind of change and like adopt these things. Like the one thing that I would say when I went to Brown for college was like no one in like that I had gone to school with had lived with anyone who had really opposing viewpoints to their own. And they had no way to grapple with them other than kind of these tribalism type of things. And I had been this staunch liberal on the side of all of these various things. And I didn't even think I was that liberal. I was a registered Republican at the time, like all of these various things. And I do think that everything that you're saying has like everything you've said today has a lot of truth. And I think it's really great that you're out there kind of doing this and talking about it, because I think that right now, especially with the riots and everything else that's going on, there just like really needs to be a lot of empathy on both sides. And so I hope that that's something that we can kind of see going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely concur. Sounds like I need to hear about your story more.
Oh.
It seems
it's like not
really
nearly
remarkable.
as interesting as growing up in Alabama.
So we are out of time. Anonymous attendee writes that David French should become a regular on In Lieu of Fun. We do this every day, 7 days a week, 5 o'clock Eastern time. You are welcome anytime. And David, it's good to hear your voice and see your face.
Well, it's great to see you. And this has been a blast. And Kate, it's great to hang out with you for a second day this week. I'd love to come back.
It's been really fun. I'm looking forward to putting our podcast out tomorrow.
Yes.
Jeff is always great. He's brilliant.
He is.
So let's do it again soon.
I'd love that.
And tomorrow we have my old friend from high school, Gail Albert Halaban, who Gail is a photographer. And she many years ago pioneered a style of photography that was considered extremely eccentric then, which was with the consent of the subjects, taking pictures of people from the window of one building into the window of another building. It's called window-to-window photography, and it has become quite a thing in the age of quarantine where nobody can see one another. And Gail has been taking pictures of people all over the world using remote photography from window to window. And there's been a whole lot of articles written about it. So she is going to come on and talk about the history of this style of photography and show a bunch of incredible pictures of people through their windows.
I'm kind of very excited about this. I mean, and then I also want to just kind of state for a lot of the political minded people that are with us that we have Matt Iglesias on Monday, Larry Lessig is coming in on Tuesday, and we have Matt Miller hopefully on Wednesday. So there is going to be a very kind of loaded second next week with a lot of commentary from a lot of people. So stay tuned.
And of course, on Saturday, it'll be just Kate and me, and David, if he wants to come back.
Yeah, David, you want to hang out?
And Sunday, we have a mystery guest that Kate will produce at 5 o'clock on Sunday.
No, it's your turn to produce the mystery guest.
Oh, it's my turn to produce a mystery guest. Good thing she reminded me of
Don't
that.
do that to me.
I was going to forget. So we will have a mystery guest who I will conjure up. And until then, Kate, what do we say?
We can't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, come hang out with us.
See you tomorrow, guys.
That's great.